Hello and welcome to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen. I'm an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I present these videos every week for a couple of different reasons. The first of which is just to move my brain out of the mode of background work as I kind of work and ponder with the text over the course of the week, and move into the process of actually writing and preparing the sermon that I will preach to my congregation for the weekend. That's the first reason that I do these. And then the second is just to allow you, the viewer, who have come across this video for whatever reason, whether you are a regular viewer week by week, or if you just happen to find this one randomly, and this is the first time you've ever watched one, to just allow you to gain some different insight into the assigned gospel text for the week. So that's why I do these. This particular Sunday, which is March 26th, 2017, the fourth Sunday of Lent. Our gospel lesson is another long one, this time coming out of John chapter 9, verses 1 through 41. Actually, the entire chapter 9 of John's gospel. Now, if you happen to catch last week's video, last week's was a very lengthy one as well. The story of the encounter of Jesus with the woman, the Samaritan woman at the well, which is equally as long as this one. You may recall I didn't read that one entirely. I will give you the opportunity to do so rather than me reading through like I normally do, because it is so long. That would make this a really long video. So I'm not going to do that. So put it on pause and go read it. John chapter 9, 1 through 41. All of John chapter 9. Are you paused? Pause. I'm serious. Pause. Okay. Did you read it? Good. Awesome. Then you're familiar with the story. I'm going to say a word. We've been now in John's gospel through the season of Lent so far. We started off with Jesus and Nicodemus at night a few weeks ago. And then last week, of course, we had as I mentioned, the Samaritan woman during the middle of the day. And now we have Jesus encountering the man born blind. In terms of where we fall within the narrative of John's gospel as a whole, we have jumped ahead a little ways. We went from chapter 4 last week now up to chapter 9. Jesus is in Jerusalem, which he had been previously for Nicodemus, and then was leaving Jerusalem to go back to Galilee via Samaria last week with the Samaritan woman at the well. Now he is actually back in Jerusalem again for another one of the festivals. There are three different festivals that the Jewish people celebrate every year and traditionally would go to Jerusalem to celebrate. This one, I believe, without looking, is either the Festival of Booths or the Festival of something else, dedication, I think. That's back in chapter 8, and I'm kind of blanking on what it is, but it's not Passover. It's one of the other festivals. But he's in Jerusalem. He's been doing some different things. And in fact, he's been in the temple and had some different interactions and actually pissed some people off. So they were picking up stones to stone him. Apparently he's teaching or challenging the people in a way that they consider blasphemy. So he's attracting some angst, and he's leaving the temple. So that's actually where the action from now the man born blind picks up. We don't know if the man's like right outside the temple gates, or if he's actually still in the temple. That's possible, or if he's out in Jerusalem somewhere. We don't know exactly where this happens within the city, but it's in the city somewhere. And it would have made sense for this man born blind to be, excuse me, I'm blanking for a second, to be where a lot of people are. He would have been a beggar. In fact, we hear that he's a beggar because of his blindness, because he can't see to care for himself. So he has to beg. Although interestingly enough, his parents are still around. We'll hear about that in the story, but that's side note. So he would have been around somewhere, and Jesus notices him now. And I want to make that point. I think that's important. As Jesus is walking along, having left the temple or leaving the temple, he sees this man, and that's kind of a harken back to last week again. Check out that video if you didn't see it. But that Jesus sees the Samaritan woman. He sees her as an individual, sees her as a person of worth, rather than just seeing whatever stigma surrounds her. Likewise, he sees the man. But what's interesting about this idea, or this not idea, this sign or miracle, John calls them signs, is that the man doesn't ask for it. And in fact, it almost seems like Jesus does the healing of this man who gives him his sight back, because the disciples notice him and pose a question. Now, it's an interesting situation. When they ask, so Jesus sees the guy, and then the disciples notice him, and they see that he's blind, and he's just kind of sitting there doing his thing. And they pose a question that was common at the time. They said, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he would have been born blind? And that reflects two different ideas. It's actually a debate that was going on at the time, which explains a little bit of why they asked the question. It was thought that an infirmity or a disability or whatever you want to call it, when a child is born with it, that's the result of the sin of their parents. That because of something that sinful that their parents had done, God punishes them by their child having a disability. The other notion, when he says, is he the one who sinned, is that as we are born into the idea of original sin, that we are sinful even within the womb, going all the way back to the idea of original sin all the way back in Genesis, that is the sin his own, and is that why he's being born blind? I just kind of facepalm at that idea that a newborn baby would be punished for original sin, which is essentially saying that we are born into sin, that our reality is flawed, that we are flawed because of the presence of sin, but that this particular child would be born with a disability as a punishment when other children who are also affected by original sin are not. Nuts. But anyway, so that is the debate that's going on, and that's why the disciples asked Jesus the question. It seems to be, even though it's kind of a weird one as we consider it now, it reflects. I need to slow my brain down just a little bit. It reflects a theological debate that was going on at the time. So that kind of points us to why they asked the question. But then I love that Jesus says neither one of them sinned, but now, as he is blind, the glory of God can be shown. Now, that raises the question. So did God make this guy blind for this specific reason, that when Jesus and the disciples walked by, they could do this sign as an example? I don't know. That, to me, I get kind of nervous thinking that direction. I don't really think that direction. I think that it's more of a situation of this man was born blind because our reality is flawed. Our reality is broken. And sometimes that stuff just happens. It just is. And there is no explanation as to why. But God can use that situation now in this instant to his glory. So not that God caused it, but it is. And God will use it through Jesus to his glory. Okay, are you with me? And that, to me, speaks to the same idea that sometimes we'll hear, like in and around a funeral, like when someone dies and when they die unexpectedly, well, God needed to take that person. God needed them in heaven. I don't buy that personally. I know some people will say that, and some people will disagree with me, and it can be a comfort to some. I don't buy that God intentionally takes someone, that God causes the death. I don't buy it. I think that God mourns death, and that God creates new life out of death, and that's what we see in the resurrection of Jesus. But that same idea. So, okay, I'm getting off subject. I want to get back to it. What I love about this story is that, again, the man doesn't ask to be healed. We have other stories of other people who are blind who realized that Jesus is around and asked for it. And maybe this is a different take on those same accounts in the other Gospels, because this story by itself is only presented in John. But here, the man doesn't ask for it. Jesus just kind of does it. And he does it in a really weird way. He spits in the dirt, in the dust, makes mud out of it, smears the mud over the guy's eyes, and tells him, go and wash in the pool of Siloam. Siloam means sent. So he is sent to the pool called Sent to wash. And when he washes, he can see. And that's the miracle. So the miracle itself actually occurs after Jesus is already gone. And here's the mind-blowing thing. So Jesus does this, indicates to the man to go, reminiscent of when Jesus heals the 10 lepers, and he sends them to go show themselves to the priests, and they're healed as they're going. Same kind of idea. But so Jesus does this, sends the man on his way, and then leaves, disappears for like the majority of the story. Jesus isn't even in most of the story, and it's this particular man's story. So he gets there and he washes his eyes and he can see. And he's glorifying God because now he can see, and he's bumping into people who recognize him, and they're like, "Aren't you the guy who was blind?" And some are like, "No, it can't be him because this guy can see. He must just look like the guy who was blind." And so they're like, "Hey, what happened?" And so he tells them the story. He tells them what happened, and he says, "I don't know who it was, but he like made mud and he put it on my eyes and he told me to go wash, and I washed and I could see. I don't know who he is. I don't know how it works, but this is what happened." And they don't buy it. And so then they take him to the Pharisees, and they're like, "So what happened?" Now he tells the story again, and they don't buy it. So they go and they get his parents, and their parents come in, and they're like, "Well, yeah, that's our son. We know that's our son, but we don't know what happened. So ask him. He's old enough. Ask him," because they're afraid they're going to get kicked out of the synagogue, and that's in the story. If you haven't read it, go back and read it. So that goes on, and then they ask the guy again, and they're constantly making like excuses of like, "Okay, we know you're a liar, whatever, you're lying, or this guy's a sinner, or whatever. What happened?" So they keep asking him, and he gets more and more bold as he continues to tell his story, and his story is the key. "I don't know how it works, but I know this has happened to me. This is what has happened," and he testifies to that. He gives testimony over and over and over again. His story does not change, even if he gets more and more bold in how he presents it. And finally, they just can't handle it. He won't recant his story. And so they kick him out of the synagogue. And now, as he has lost his community, which, we can argue all kinds of stuff of would he have been welcome in the community from the get-go since he was a beggar, but since he's been kicked out of the synagogue, he's lost that Jewish identity, and I think that's important to hammer on, that for the Jewish culture it revolved around the synagogue. Now in Jerusalem it would have been in the temple as well, but it would seem that there were also synagogues potentially, though I could be wrong about that, in Jerusalem. But the idea of the synagogue being the central location of a Jewish community, the place where people would gather, the place where they found their identity in that community, he had been cast out of that. And some scholars will talk about that John, which was of course written way after the fact, was written to a community who had been cast out of the synagogue. So they would have understood this. They would have been able to relate to this. But anyway, so all of that being said, the man is cast out. Still can see the miracle, the sign, it's still in effect. He can still see, even if he doesn't understand how it works, even if he doesn't know that it was God in the flesh, being Jesus, who did this for him. He just knows that some guy spit in the mud, smeared the mud on his eyes, and told him to go wash, and it worked. And so now he encounters Jesus. Jesus goes and finds him, and this is important. Jesus spotted him initially, performed the sign in his life, and now, as the man is lacking community, Jesus finds him, and that's literally what the Greek is, and brings him into a new community, and opens his eyes figuratively, spiritually, if you want to say that, to say that I am the one who have done this. I am. God has done this for you. And now offering him new relationship. Now it ends, I'm going to wrap this up. The story ends with some of the Pharisees still being snarky and saying, "Well, are we blind?" And Jesus makes kind of a cryptic, odd situation. He says, "If you know that you are blind, then you will see. If you think that you can see, you are blind," which is kind of like, what? But I think that speaks to the idea of recognizing our brokenness. I'm reminded of the parable that Jesus tells of the Pharisee and the tax collector who come to pray, and the Pharisee's like, "I thank you, God, that I'm not like other people. I do this and I do this, I do this, and I refrain from doing that. And I thank you that I'm not like this tax collector." So he is the focal point, and he can't see past his own status. Whereas the tax collector says, "Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner." He recognizes his brokenness. And I think that's what Jesus is getting at here. Can we see our own brokenness? Because if we can, then we can find we can see the glory of the cross. We can see the glory of what God is doing for us, that God is offering us life. Not that we have earned it, not that we achieve it. So our blindness that he's speaking about there is the lack of belief. That's a theme in John. Or our blindness is the inability to recognize our own brokenness and our own need for a Savior. That's kind of what's going on in this. I could keep going because, again, 41 verses of John. There's a lot going on in there. There's tons of stuff we could focus on, but I think I'm going to focus on the idea of being found. Last week it was being seen, the Samaritan woman. I think this time it's being found. And then having been found, whether we get it or not, sharing what has happened, which is a common theme. So if you have thoughts, questions, comments, by all means, throw those down in the comment section, and we will continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, have a great week, and we will catch you next time.